Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. We have Novak Djokovic versus Learner Tien for the first round matchup at the US Open. This is going to be an interesting one because they have never played before, and Learner Tien has a 4-1 head-to-head record against top 10 players. Only recently has he actually lost to a top 10 player, which was to Andre Rublev in Cincinnati, if my memory serves me correctly, and it does, in the round of 64, so the second round. But he had actually beaten him a few weeks earlier in Washington at the City Open in straight sets as well, and then Rublev got revenge, beating him in straights. I'll talk a bit more about that, and we'll talk about Djokovic as well. Before we do get into it though, remember that like button, do subscribe if you're new, and do leave a rating or review if you're listening on a podcast platform. On top of also talking about both players and how they match up, because there's no head-to-head to analyze and delve into, we have partnered up with Tennis Insights and TennisViz, so thank you to them for some really good insights, and we'll go through that when we do our analysis. And it does back up, I think, my thoughts on how this one might play out and the matchup in general. Before we do get into that though, I want to very briefly talk about their form so far in the last few weeks. As I mentioned, Learner Tien has been some really top players, in honesty, in a pretty short span of time. And if we talk just about the players that he's beaten in 2025, top 10 players: Daniel Medvedev at the Australian Open, Alexander Zverev in the Mexican Open, Ben Shelton in Mallorca on grass, and then obviously Andre Rublev in Washington. So 3 out of those 4 wins were on hard court. So yeah, a very big plus for him, and he'll be thinking that, look, I'm able to raise my level against top 10, and we'll come back to that in a second, because it's easier to just sit here and say, yeah, he plays better against top 10 players, and you know, the stats say he's 4-1, but it could just be that, as a coincidence, on those 4 days that he beat those top 10 players, maybe they just weren't playing their best level. Or did he raise his level? Well, Tennis Insights have provided the data on that, so we can come to that in a second. Before we do though, I want to talk about Djokovic, and he has not played any warm-up tournaments before the US Open. Look, he's now at 38 years of age. He knows how to prepare for these tournaments, whether it mean not playing tournaments before that as warm-ups or going straight into it. So I'm not too worried about that. He's had a very solid year. I mean, semi-finals of all 3 Grand Slams that he's competed in so far. The Australian Open he had to retire from as well. French Open and Wimbledon he lost to Yannick in straight sets. The positive thing for him is that he's in the opposite half of Yannick at the US Open. I think he'd prefer to have Carlos in his half, because at the Australian Open, as we know, he beat him in the quarterfinals. In saying that, he'd face him in the semi-final stage, and that has been an issue for him, I think, physically more than anything. So now let's break down the matchup from an analytics point of view, so touching upon the Tennis Insights, and then also how I visualize it playing out in terms of tactically. So we're talking about Learner Tien's record against top 10 players, and we'll get to that Tennis Insight in a second. But what I want to touch upon, which will just bear with me, it does then lead on to the Learner Tien top 10 insight. He's talking about Novak Djokovic. Now, since 2015, he's in attack percentage, which is the percentage of points that he is in control of on the front foot, essentially dictating and being aggressive in those rallies, in those points for more often than not in those particular rallies, has increased in a big way. So in 2015 it was at 21%. It did interestingly dip to 20% in 2016, but then from 2016 all the way now to 2025, it's gone from 20% all the way to 24%. That's a 4% differential, which is pretty big. And what's interesting, from 20% to 26% even, which is a 6% differential, which is even more impressive. And what he's done is he's essentially played more and more aggressively the older he's got, which is, I mean, it's incredibly intelligent from him, because he knows that, look, physically, I'm not going to be getting any better, and I need to be able to shorten points as much as possible as I'm getting older and older and older, and it needs to become more and more efficient for me to shorten those points, and he's been doing that. So you can see how he's got more and more attacking, and you'll see the graphic as well as his career has gone on. And he's on, as you can see in the graphic, is 2024, up to 2024, but for 2025, it was confirmed that he's still at 26% in attack for the year so far, which is interesting. And that then leads me nicely onto Learner Tien, and I'm just going to bring up a metric here, or a little diagram, let's say, of Learner Tien. So if we look at the orange shape, or I guess the orange shape, you can see inside the circle, that is Tien's 52-week average. The black shape is the 52-week average for the tour. So the average tour player. And the green is his shot quality shape, let's say, for whenever he plays a top 10 player. So the 5 matches he's played against top 10 players. And you can see, if we compare the green to the orange, serve, return, forehand, backhand, steal score, baseline points won are all higher. Some of them substantially higher, the biggest one being forehand quality. Conversion score is slightly lower, relatively tight. I mean, it's slightly lower, let's say, and that would make sense as he's playing better quality players. And the in attack has dropped, and again, that makes sense, because the majority of players that he comes up against who are top players, they're going to try and attack against his style of play, which is more counter punching, and he probably won't have as many balls to attack because of the quality coming from the other side of the court. Now that puts us in a really intriguing position where Novak is going to be attacking as much as possible to try and shorten points. And for Learner Tien, his average against top 10 players, when he has dropped in his in-attack percentage, which is 19%, so that's a differential of 7, right, between Novak and him. That means that more likely than not, we are going to see Novak on the front foot trying to dictate and be aggressive, and Tien having to defend and actually wrestle momentum back in his favor whenever he can in those longer rallies against Novak, which will be really interesting to see. One thing I want to point out before we move on from this graphic is his forehand quality of 8.2 against top 10 players would put him in the top 10 for forehand quality on tour. And that's, of course, if he maintained it across the year. So that is very interesting, and it just shows that his forehand, for whatever reason, it really does jump up levels. And there are some players that their level increases if the player on the other side of the court is also playing a higher level and really pushes them to their limits. And one player that I think that's been quite prominent with, especially historically, is actually been Alcaraz. Alcaraz can have dips and he can lose to a player that you might not expect, for example, like a Van der Zandschulp last year at the US Open. But then actually, when he comes up against a Sinner or a Djokovic, his level, because he's so excited, because he knows that he cannot take anything for granted, it does increase, and you see less of those dips in quality and form. I think for Tien, he knows that he's not able to gain a lot of free points against these top players, and I think he really relishes the challenge by the looks of it. So this will be, for him, I'm sure it'll be an incredible experience for him to really test himself against the greatest of all time. In terms of how it might play out, I mean, I think if Tien is able to replicate his form that he has against top 10 players, he puts himself in a decent position, no doubt. I think his return quality of 6.4 is going to have to be better against Novak, that's for sure, because Novak will definitely open up chances and break the Tien serve, which is, look, I mean, we're looking at 7.3 when it's at his best against top 10 players, and that's solid, but it's not anything that's going to really trouble Novak. So I think what he's going to have to do is really rely on his baseline quality and try and make it awkward for Novak with his leftiness, you might say. But he doesn't hit with a lot of pace, so he won't give Novak a lot to work with, and I think he needs to utilize angles and depth and a bit of variety to disrupt the rhythm of Novak Djokovic. I think for Djokovic, he's a big favorite. I think he'll probably take half a set, maybe a set, to figure out. Tien has never played before. That tends to be the case for him whenever he hasn't played someone. But then I think he will probably work it out. And as much as I'd like to say Tien will win, and given the top 10 record he has, I just think Novak, as I said, I think he'll figure it out. And I think he'll win, and I think he'll win in 4 sets. Let me know in the comment section below what you think and why. Thanks very much, guys. Stay safe and well, and we'll see you on the next video.